The right is ideologically blind. This blindness is why we lost the cultural war, to the left. The left is not smart, it is just that they know what they are doing. The right tends to be blind both to their own position and the level of awareness of the left. However, let's approach this issue from the perspective of economics, specifically the division of economics between capitalism and communism, or its more popular variant, socialism. First of all, the difference between these ideologies is not as great as many on the right believe. Once more, the left is more honest in their evaluations, which gives them an edge. The right prefers to call the left woke as a way to insinuate they are asleep, both as to their motives and the impact what they are doing has. We will see the right bemoan the election and re-election of far-left, traitorous politicians. The right will rant about what the left is doing to the nation, traditions, and common man, as if the left were totally blind to the repercussions of their actions and were, presumably, doing all the wrong things by accident or malice. But even malice requires a level of awareness that the right does not grant the left. When taxes increase under the leadership of a left-leaning government, the right spits out mountains of analysis to demonstrate how these higher taxes will hurt the economy and the productive sector. The information is not necessarily wrong. What is wrong is thinking all we need to do is to speak the truth and evil will reform and repent. In this, the right is no more sensible than the left. The criminal is not someone unaware that robbery is wrong. The right is always attempting to wake people up as if education is the panacea for all that is wrong with the world. Many of us have not figured out that people are evil, not because they did not learn right from wrong, but because they did, and realized living in the wrong way was right for them. People do not need to be taught that murder, rape and robbery is wrong. No one gets to the point where they can commit crimes without learning crime is wrong. The right think they are awake because they support capitalism and responsibility. It is true we tend to be harder on those of the left. We oppose benefits for those who will not work. We think people who are unemployed ought to be given jobs, and if they get benefits at all, it ought to come with conditions. In general, the right is vocal about limiting the amount of help the poor can get. This naturally upsets the left, who are far more liberal when it comes to those who occupy the lower rungs of society's ladder. The left will attack the wealth of the higher income earners as if their income was in some way a benefit they get that others do not. For the right, this is a ludicrous argument. In the mind of the right, an investment banker and insurance salesman is every bit a worker as the millwright or janitor. This is why the right oppose the labor theory of value. But this opposition hides a massive ideological error. We could go into a long and complex argument as to what profits, especially from rent and returns on financial vehicles, are wrong, but the same result can be had by taking a different route. The arguments for profits, whether from businesses, renting, or investments in financial markets or services, are all predicated on a particular view of ownership. The right believes we can own private property. At this point, we need to distinguish between private personal property and private commercial property, because they are vastly different things. We all have personal property and we all must have personal property. To not own it is almost irrelevant, as we must have access to it. This access must be of a sort that pretty much reflects the way we would have, if we owned it. In other words, we have to eat, sleep, clothe ourselves and travel. We need personal property to be human and live the life of a human being. So, to contest the right to own personal property is both absurd and pointless. Whatever you call our possession of what we use, we have to have almost unrestricted access to a basic amount of property to have a life. Not every culture needs the same amount of personal property or the same mix. People who live in colder climates need different kinds of property than those who live in tropical regions. We all need food, clothing, and shelter, but what this looks like will change depending on where you live and what you do for a living. However, it is up to each of us to divest ourselves of what is surplus. Regardless of our personal needs, everything we have is ultimately God's, and so it is up to us to utilize what He has provided judiciously. Personal belongings do not exist to glorify us, they exist to make us useful as His people. However, the right has confused private with personal property and act as if private, commercial property is of the same class of things as personal property. This means that a capitalist owning huge tracts of land looks at this as if it was a suburban lot. The right can see that it is wrong for the state to provide the poor with unlimited personal property or access to private commercial property, but they cannot see any problem with the state giving a license to a private individual that permits them to do as they will to land, water, and other resources. Is there any amount of money that can compensate for the loss of resources needed by a nation? Of course, we all know there are limits to what an owner can do with what he has been given a license to. Homeowners cannot even undertake extensive renovations without the approval of the state. Commercial property owners are also under the jurisdiction of the state. No one actually owns anything. We license property for a particular use, overseen by the state. The state represents a liability to the owner because the state retains a claim to all of the property within its jurisdiction. Thus, despite the myth, no one owns anything. The state may claim to have authority over the nation, but realistically, its power is limited. It cannot act as an owner without enraging the public. The state can only be tolerated so long as it permits its subjects to own property. As mentioned, this is under license and with a large number of restrictions. Zoning laws, building codes, and regulations governing personal and private use all put severe limits on what anyone can do with what they own. Regardless, many in the West still think they own their property and that they even have a right to own property. But the state cannot validate any ownership claim by their subjects. The state can only own what it can defend. The state may well be able to defend the borders of its nation, but this only means that ownership is nothing more than a display of power. If all the nation has to buttress its claim to the land of a nation, is a standing army, it means it has no moral argument to justify its claim. If the state can only point to its armed forces as the source of its legitimacy, then it follows any force that is greater than the force the state has the greater right to own the land. Many native groups claim ownership based on prior possession. But prior use is not a moral argument and cannot withstand a logical challenge. There is nothing in logic that would suggest the first squatter to occupy a parcel has the greater right. The reality is the individual can only occupy a limited amount of land at any one time. If we apply the principle to a group of persons, we will still need to clarify what it means to occupy a place. Those appealing to such rules would also be required to demonstrate they have abided by this same principle, but the only rule that tribes and people have lived by consistently, is the law of the jungle. The law of the jungle states that might makes right and the end justifies the means. Groups that are stronger have always taken from groups that are weaker. That has been the only constant throughout history, and it is the only rule the whole of mankind has lived under. It may not be the best rule possible, and it may not be the most desirable law to live under, but the reality is, when two populations disagree, the only recourse is to go to war. War or physical conflict is the only thing left when people cannot settle an issue any other way. Those who do not wish to be subject to the law of the jungle, or the scenario of might makes right, need to find another way to live than this, because the law of the jungle is the way of the flesh. The right is under the illusion that it lives under a different mandate than the left. They are mirror images but only in the senses that two armies mirror each other. The left and right are poised for war and in the end, they have no path to reconciliation, other than war and violence, and that is more about domination than a settling of differences. Democracy is little more than war conceptualized. The winner of an election gets the same authority as the winner of a war. If one group does not agree with the results of an election, the recourse is war. In the profane system of things, which is the system this world is under, the final option is always to resort to violence. It is war that is the final arbiter of all differences of opinion, unless one side decides not to pursue the argument but settle with their opponent by some other means. But war can never be taken off of the table, and it always remains an option. Behind this dependency on war as the court of last resort, is the truth that no one has a right to what both sides claim. This is why war is the court of final appeal. We fight over property, but none of it belongs to the right or the left. The state does not own the world, but the private owner has no right to the world, either. But both the people in the aggregate and the people as sovereign individuals, claim the property of the planet. They are brigands and robbers and fight over what they have no right to. The state in the name of the people can only prosecute its claim to the property of the nation if it can defeat other nations and hold in subjugation its own citizens. In other words, the state owns only what it can claim and retain by force of arms. It has no persuasive arguments beyond its military prowess to make its claim. But the same goes for the sovereign individual. No amount of banks' money or fiat dollars will give the individual more right to own the resources of the world than a gun or club. It is only the power of the state backing your claim that gives private owners any rights to property. These rights can be removed from individuals, by the state, as easily as they are given. In short, both left and right are claiming what they have no right to, and this is why the left and right are in a war over who owns what and who has the most right to the world's resources. They cannot convince the other side of their claim because both claims are fictitious, but neither side will permit the other to pursue their claims unopposed. So the battle continues without let-up. In the end, both left and right are unjust claimants to what does not belong to them, and so both those on the left and those on the right are parasites. The world belongs to God. All assets are created by God and are therefore owned by God. No individual or collection of individuals has any right to claim property that is physical because all that is natural is God's. Capitalism is as every bit as parasitic as socialism. Neither has any credibility in the eyes of God. A priorism is the belief that the only thing we can own is what we create as equity. Mankind cannot own assets, but we can own the value we add to assets through work.